Okay, so now we're on to chapter 6, which is called Hang. So in this chapter, Leah is feeling down and is reflecting on her feelings as she walks through the village at night. As she's reflecting, she says, "Now you can control geese by the way you fling out the rice. Get the rhythm of the flail as it clicks over your head. You can walk the yoke without slopping the buckets. Better than Ke. No, you're not Chinese, but you're not Chinese either. It doesn't matter anymore." So the imagery in this sentence really creates a picture in our minds of how Leah has fit into life in the village, how she has started to feel at home and started to feel that she really belongs there. And the parallelism in the sentence, "You're not Chinese, but you're not Chinese either," really shows how, whereas at the beginning of the novel, she was completely in denial about any kind of Chinese heritage that she had, she's now completely accepting of herself and of her heritage. She doesn't feel that sense of confusion about being half Australian and half Chinese. If you think back to on the plane when she was arriving in China and the hostess said to her, "Oh, welcome home." And she was very adamant about the fact that she wasn't Chinese, she looked Australian. And so we can see the complete change that has taken place in Leah's mindset. While she's walking through the village, she spots Heng riding through quietly with a truck full of fertilizer. Now, if you remember, in Ke and Linan's village, the reason why their animals are so well fed is because they need to be, so they produce fertilizer. Because Heng, the village cadre, actually keeps the fertilizer for himself and sells it so that he can have a coloured television, he can have extra money. So she kind of catches him in the act of hiding that fertilizer from the other villagers. Together with Tong, Linan, and the other villagers, they catch him and they shame him into giving them the fertilizer. So they kind of surround him and say, Tong is the leader in this. He says, "Oh, thank you so much, Heng, for getting us this extra fertilizer." And of course, he can't admit that it isn't for them, that it's actually for himself. A few days later, Joan and Leah leave for Beijing, promising Linan that they will find Ke. So they kind of have this big victory in defeating Heng as he tries to be really corrupt, but then they have to leave and go find Ke in Beijing and continue their travels through China. But as they leave, Leah looks back and she sees Heng and realizes that he's very angry about what has happened. Another quote that we have from Leah while she's in that kind of reflective state is this one here. "Maybe you're low because you're leaving China now and you're just discovering Joan." So we have a bit of a metaphor here. She's not actually physically discovering Joan, but what she's doing is she's learning about Joan. And so she's a bit worried that now they're leaving China, things might not be the same. So the links to discovery that we have in this chapter, Leah discovers her new connection to her Chinese heritage and tries to negotiate the balance between her life in Australia and what she has experienced in China. So it's again this idea of self-discovery, that she's realizing these new aspects of herself and her heritage and trying to figure out how her life will be different when she returns to Australia, given everything that she's experienced over the past few weeks. She also discovers the reality of corruption in China through the village cadre Heng. So that experience of actually catching him red-handed makes the corruption in China very real to her. She also discovers her own ability to make change. So her actions on that night made a big difference to the lives of the villagers. So she's able to see that, like Ke, who goes and protests with the students, she is able to make change in the village herself. However, as they leave the village, she realizes that her small act of rebellion has not changed the situation that Tong and Linan live in. So Heng is still the authority, he still has the power in that village, and Tong and Linan are the ones who will have to deal with the consequences of Leah's actions. So I think that as she leaves the village, heading to Beijing, she does get that slight feeling of guilt that she's done what she thought was a good thing, but it may have very negative consequences for her family. So why is this chapter called Heng? It's called Heng because it centers around Leah kind of catching him out and seeing that corruption of the party officials firsthand and kind of trying to bring a bit of change about. Moving into chapters 27 and 28, which are called Beijing and Tiananmen, Leah and Joan arrive in Beijing. At first, Joan is hesitant and suspicious, but gradually she calms down. The next day, she allows Leah to go to Tiananmen Square to look for Ke. Leah explores Tiananmen Square looking for Ke and taking in everything around her. They find each other at the Goddess of Democracy, and he shows her around the square. Ke gives her the two halves of the coin, which he has had a glass blower put into a small glass globe together. So the two halves of the coin have been joined inside a round piece of glass. And so he shows this to Leah, and she asks to take it back to show her mother, and then she'll return it to him later. When she sees it for the first time, we have this piece of description: not a butterfly, two halves of a coin forced apart by one swelling bubble, forever dancing about each other, never quite touching. So we have symbolism of the coin here, and we also have personification of the coin as they dance about each other. And so Ke had intended that the glass blower would capture the two halves of the coin joined together inside the globe. But because of an accident, there's a small bubble of air which splits the two coins apart. And this is a really powerful symbol of the outcome of this story. Okay, so it's kind of foreshadowing what happens towards the end, but we'll get to that shortly. Leah discovers the reality of the protests in Tiananmen Square. She and Ke find each other, and Ke gives Leah the glass with the two halves of the coin, which she will later discover is highly symbolic. So what does the Goddess of Democracy represent? So obviously, democracy in the Western world is known to represent freedom, the ability to have a voice and to have control over your own fate and the government of your country. So the Goddess of Democracy represents everything that the students are fighting for: freedom, justice, and hope. And Leah, in her description of the Goddess of Democracy, makes a point that it's not just that she's kind of a symbol, it's almost like she's the leader of their protest, where she's kind of facing up towards the Forbidden City, demanding change. What are the conditions like for the protesters? So in this chapter we see that the conditions in Tiananmen Square are quite horrific. There's a stench that Leah notices, people are breaking out in sores, people are, saying that there's going to be an epidemic of disease. So life in Tiananmen Square is not easy for the students. It's actually really horrible. And so that's something that I think Leah hadn't considered up until this point in the novel. And it becomes clear as she walks around and Bailey describes everything that she sees. What does Tiananmen mean to Ke? So to Ke, it means hope, the possibility of change, and a sense of solidarity with the people of China, who together are united against Guanji, the corruption of the officials. What has Ke done with the coin, and what does this represent? So he's combined the two pieces of the coin in that round piece of glass, but this represents the joining of the two families, but that small bubble between them represents that they will never be truly connected. There's always something going to come up between them, so that as we hear in this quote, they are never quite touching. Then we move into chapters 29 and 30, Saturday and Sunday. So the next day, Leah does not see Kerr again as she goes to the Great Wall with Joan. She chooses the harder path to climb, and this leads them to think about David, her father. For the first time, she comments that she's able to think of him without pain. And we have this key quote here, which is part of her interior monologue. She was not sure how it had happened, but now she could think of Dad without pain. So she's able to remember her father in a joyful way, or not necessarily joyful, but in a fond way where she's able to look back on those happy memories. And as she's thinking about how that happened, how she got to that point where she could think of him without pain, Leah realizes she supposed Joan, crazy Joan, was in there somewhere, part of the cure, part of growing up, part of everything. She would work it all out one day. So we have the metaphor of Joan being part of the cure for, I guess, Leah's heartbreak over losing her father. And we have the repetition of part of, which is a little bit of anaphora. So she would work it all out one day. She's kind of realizing that Joan has helped her in coming to terms with her father's death, but she doesn't fully understand it yet. So when we have this statement, she would work it all out one day, we see that Leah still has a way to go on her journey of self-discovery and her discovery of her mother. The next morning, she gets ready to see Kerr, but while eating breakfast, a man tells her that the students are all gone. She rushes to Tiananmen in shock, but it is too dangerous to go any further. She speaks to people on the street who tell her 100 students were killed by soldiers. She tells herself Kerr will call, but he does not. So she thinks back to the crackers that woke her up the previous night while she was sleeping, and she dismissed it thinking that it was just firecrackers from a wedding. But what she hears the next day makes her think that it was gunshots that she heard. And we have a bit of symbolism and foreshadowing in this description here, which occurs while Leah is getting ready to go out. They're standing at the hotel window and she spots some birds flying past. The birds scraped past her nose, exploded toward the sun, flashed and disappeared as if they had never been there. So these birds could represent any number of things. It could be Kerr, it could be the students, it could be the fleeting kind of happiness that she had in the village. So this image here of something that is beautiful but doesn't last very long and disappears as though it had never existed, this kind of is foreshadowing and symbolizing a number of things that happen in the novel. And again, the foreshadowing, Kerr did not phone that night. So this is designed to make the audience feel really kind of concerned and worried. Why haven't we heard from Kerr? Is he, one of the students who's been killed? We're starting to feel that same panic that Leah is feeling about Kerr. So the links to discovery that we have in this chapter, Leah discovers that her feelings about her father have changed. She begins to realize that her mother has helped her to grow and learn, which is something she would never have thought at the beginning of the novel. So again, we see how through this journey of discovery, her perspective has changed a great deal. She discovers that something terrible has happened at Tiananmen Square, but she's yet to fully understand what has gone on. So how has Leah moved on, and what leads her to despair later on? So she's moved on in that she's moved on from the death of her father. She's feeling a lot better about that and able to cope with it much better. What leads her to despair later is her concern about Kerr and her belief that something terrible has happened to him. What happens at the end of chapter 30? At the end of chapter 30, Kerr fails to contact her, and we also see on the news report that the government is reporting that in the conflict between the students and the soldiers, 30 people were killed, which is not the 100 that Leah has heard from other people. And what they're actually saying is that of that 30, 27 were soldiers and 3 were students. So it's being portrayed in the media as though the students have been the attackers and the soldiers have been the victims. So at the end of chapter 30, we start to see that this is being covered up by the government, which only causes more concern for Leah and Joan. Chapter 31 is called The Avenue of Eternal Peace. In this chapter, Leah goes out into Beijing to try and find out more information. She sees signs of violence and closed shopping centres. Leah hears gunshots and sees trucks full of soldiers driving past her. She looks at the soldiers and remembers her cousin Tiny, so the G family, who she met at the beginning of her trip in China. She actually stayed in the bedroom of one of her cousins who was called Tiny, and he was a soldier. So as she looks at these soldiers, she can see in them her own cousin, which gives her kind of a unique perspective. Leah sees a woman taking photos of the soldiers and witnesses her being shot as she attempts to run away. And this is quite a shocking scene in the novel. So Leah is obviously traumatized by what she sees, which is an innocent woman being murdered in cold blood, okay, which is a very shocking thing for a 16-year-old to witness. So this is a quote that kind of shows the impact of that moment. Leah was left alone at the side of the road, numb and staring at the spreading stain on the road. After a long time, she shuffled back to the hotel like a very old woman. So we have symbolism, the spreading stain on the road. So that actually refers to the blood, which is spilling onto the road. And this idea of a blood stain represents a loss of innocence, and it represents the impact of violence on the country. So the same way that the blood stains the road, this violence will stain China's history. It will become a mark on China's history. And the simile that we have at the end, after a long time, she shuffled back to the hotel like a very old woman. So this shows that this experience has aged her. She's been shocked by what she's seen to the point where she feels fragile, but she feels like she has a very different view of the world now, which is natural. After witnessing something like that, it does change an individual's perspective, and that's what we see through this simile that Bailey has used. Links to discovery that we have in this chapter. So Leah discovers firsthand the violence and cruelty of the soldiers. However, her memory of Tiny allows her to see a different perspective of the soldiers. So this actually shows you that an individual's past experiences have an ongoing impact on their perspective and the way in which they interpret the things around them. So because Leah knows that she has a relative who is one of those soldiers, one of those young boys with guns and helmets, the way she looks at them is very different than she might otherwise. So just this question here, what horrifying event does Leah witness? What she's witnessed is the murder of that woman, and that's an event which will have a significant impact on her. Then we go into our final chapter, chapter 32, which is called Night. In this chapter, Leah and Joan are evacuated by the Australian Embassy, so they're removed from Beijing. Leah and Joan stay with other Australian students and tourists. From their stories, Leah is able to build a picture of what happened at Tiananmen. As they are evacuated from Beijing and taken to the airport, Leah and Joan look at the coins with new eyes, finally seeing what it meant to Ke. So the key quotes that we have in this scene, well, if anyone at all, asks for Leah Waters or Zhu Leah, well, that's me. Now here, Leah is talking to the receptionist at the embassy and saying that if anyone calls, and she's hoping it will be Ke, she's giving them her identity. And what is symbolic here is the names that she gives. So the fact that she gives her two names, Leah Waters, but also her Chinese name, Zhu Leah. And that shows that she's accepting that she kind of does have these two identities, Australian and Chinese. which again shows a great change in her perspective from the beginning of the novel. The Queen has been so many things: a secret, a treasure, a family keystone, and an accident. What was it now? So the symbolism of the Queen, and we see how its meaning has changed over time and how it has changed for Leah. And we start to see that she's beginning to question what it means and starting to think about its significance from Ke's perspective. It could have captured the image of a warm, gentle China, but it had been torn apart by a cough, by an eruption of sudden violence, and maybe it would never heal. She saw the Queen with Ke's eyes. So that bubble that's in between the two halves of the coin inside the glass, that's referred to as a cough. So that cough created the bubble when the glass blower was making it. And so this kind of metaphor here is comparing that little bubble in the glass to an eruption of sudden violence, which is what we actually saw at Tiananmen Square. So she's finally beginning to understand how Ke understood the coin to be a symbol of China. The two halves, the students and the government, would be forever divided by the sudden violence of Tiananmen Square. Okay? And this idea that maybe it would never heal, maybe it would never come together because this violence was so horrific. So she's starting to see why, although for her it was about reconnecting with family and healing a broken family, for Ke it also represents the almost inevitable divide that exists in China. And this idea that it may never heal. There may never be a connection between those two different parts of his country. And then the final sentence that we have in the novel, so this is what Alan Bailey leaves us with. The two women clung to each other in the back of the crowded truck. Now, what's significant about this quote here is the fact that it's no longer mother and daughter. Leah and Joan have just become two women. So it shows that for Leah, she's no longer a little girl. She's become a woman from her experiences in China and from the things that she has witnessed. So it's been a great maturing experience for her in that she's grown up, not only in terms of her relationship with her mother, in terms of her understanding of her identity, but also her understanding of the world. Because given what she knows has happened in Tiananmen Square, she now has a much more mature view of the world and the realities of the world that she lives in. Leah discovers the extent of what happened at Tiananmen and loses hope for Ke. So she's learning that it wasn't hundreds who died at Tiananmen Square, it was thousands. And she's beginning to lose hope that Ke has survived because she's yet to hear from him. As they leave, she and Joan finally discover the true meaning of the coin from Ke's perspective when he said it was China. So the two broken pieces of the coin, they finally understand that for Ke, that represented the two broken pieces of China. So explain what shows Leah and Joan have changed by the end of the novel. So I think that this final quote really shows how they have changed. Not only that Leah has matured, but also this fact that they cling to each other. Whereas before they were so distant and divided, now they really rely on one another and support each other through this traumatic event. In terms of the discoveries that have been made, as we look back on the novel, we can see that there have been a number of discoveries, and in later videos we will explore what those discoveries are, how we can group them in order to then write about them in your essays.